The Arabian Peninsula is a rich and nearly untouched territory for archaeologists. In pre-Islamic times, it was dotted with small kingdoms and crisscrossed by caravan routes to the Mediterranean. Ancient Arab peoples, Nabateans, Libyans, Tamud, interacted with Assyrians and Babylonians, Romans and Greeks. During the 19th century, some remarkable men and women traveled to the Arabian Peninsula to find traces of these extraordinary civilizations. They brought back striking drawings or pictures from their journeys and detailed accounts of their travels that contribute greatly to our knowledge of the history of the Arabian Peninsula. For the most part, these adventurers traveled under the protection of either tribes or governments, and the accounts of their travels pay tribute to the hospitality and companionship they encountered on their journeys. Johann Burckhardt was a young Swiss explorer and pioneering European traveler whose goal was to discover the source of the river Niger. In 1809, Burckhardt set off for Aleppo in Syria to perfect his knowledge of Arabic and Islam in the belief that he could travel in Africa more easily as a Muslim. In 1812, Burckhardt slowly made his way from Damascus to Cairo by a little-known and dangerous land route. Posing as a Muslim traveler, he heard tales from desert Bedouins of the extraordinary ruins of an ancient city hidden in the remote Shara Mountains, Petra. No European had seen the fabled city or lived to tell about it. Winding his way along an extremely narrow gorge, the explorer came unexpectedly upon the great rock temple of Kazne. More than 30 meters high and carved entirely out of the face of the sheer cliff, the Kazne has become the symbol of Petra. By the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, the city of Petra had become a rich and powerful center of the caravan trade. During the next 400 years, its dominion spread as far north as Damascus. Petra's earliest tombs and temples, dating from 300 BC, show Egyptian and Assyrian characteristics. Under Greek and later Roman influences, the Nabateans developed their own distinctive architectural style. This discovery in itself would have satisfied a lesser man, but Burckhardt, who wanted to find the source of the Niger, went to Cairo planning to join a caravan to Fezzan in Libya. Burckhardt, hating to remain idly in Cairo, sailed down the Nile to explore Nubia, and then decided to cross the Red Sea and make the pilgrimage to Mecca. Burckhardt spent 3 months in Mecca, giving him an opportunity for investigation and exploration that previous travelers did not have. He mapped the city and gathered information from a wide variety of sources about the virtually unknown southern and eastern parts of the Arabian Peninsula. He then went on to spend 3 productive months in Medina. In 1815, Burckhardt was taken ill and had to return to Cairo. In 1817, worn out by disease and hardship, he died in Cairo at the age of 33. He had exhaustively described the rites of the pilgrimage, the Kaaba, the sacred mosque, the history of Mecca, as well as the customs and dress of the various classes of Meccan society. Even the great explorer Sir Richard Burton reprinted some of his descriptions as an appendix to his own travels. One of the most famous Western travelers to Arabia was Sir Richard Burton, who in 1853 set off on a pilgrimage to Mecca, his knighthood and fame as the translator of the Arabian Nights still far in the future. To travel to Mecca, Burton disguised himself as an Afghan holy man and set off on the grueling ride across the desert to the port of Suez. At Suez, he booked passage on a 50-ton ship and spent 12 days sailing to Yanbu on the Arabian Red Sea coast. On July 25th, the pilgrims caught their first glimpse of Medina, the last resting place of the Prophet Muhammad. Burton spent a month in Medina, adding a great deal to the account of Burckhardt, whose illness had prevented the Swiss explorer from visiting the environs of the city. When a pilgrim caravan from Damascus arrived in Medina on its way to Mecca, Burton joined it. He was excited by the prospect of following the inland route from Medina to Mecca, the route taken by the famous Caliph Aaron the Just. No European had taken this route since the time of the Italian adventurer de Varthema 350 years before. The pilgrims entered Mecca late at night, and Burton had to wait until the next morning for his first sight of the sacred mosque and the Kaaba. This was the ultimate goal of his journey. Profoundly moved, not only by the sight of the Kaaba, but by the devotion of the pilgrims, Burton went through the complicated ceremonies of the Hajj, describing in detail the actions and prayers which accompany the various rites. He measured the Kaaba, entered its interior chamber, and sketched a plan of it on the hem of his white pilgrim's garb. He visited all the places of interest in the region around Mecca and made copious notes on the customs and dress of the inhabitants of the Hijaz. In his journal, Burton wrote, "I may truly say that of all the worshippers who clung weeping to the curtain, who pressed their beating hearts to the stone, none felt for the moment a deeper emotion than did the pilgrim from the far north." At last, he took passage to Bombay to write his famous 3-volume work, considered by many to be the classic English account of the Hajj, a personal narrative of a pilgrimage to Al-Madinah and Mecca. Burton was a prolific author and translator, perhaps best known for his 16-volume translation of the Arabian Nights, which brought him great fame and wealth in England. The Arabian Nights is a collection of fables, fairy tales, and historical anecdotes from varying ethnic sources, including Indian, Persian, and Arabic oral traditions. While their specific origins are unknown, it's certain that the stories have been circulating orally for centuries before they were written down in a 14th century Syrian manuscript. Lady Anne Blunt was the granddaughter of the poet Lord Byron and one of the most amazing women of her time. She was the first Western woman to cross the Nafud Desert on horseback and the first to visit the town of Hail in Central Arabia. In 1878, she and her husband Wilfred Scawen Blunt went there in search of the pure-blood Arabian horse.
We have made a plan of importing some of the best Anaze blood to England and breeding it pure there. It would be an interesting and useful thing to do, and I should like much to try it.
Their most daring expedition was a journey to Nejd, a highland sacred to all Syrian Bedouins. What began as an episode in the pursuit of thoroughbred Arab horses ended as an epic of desert travel. They covered 400 miles of stony desert between Damascus and Al-Jof. Isolated by rugged mountains and fierce deserts, few regions in the world were more inaccessible. Only 3 European men had preceded them. On the way, they were ambushed in a gazu, or raid, by Bedouins. At Al-Jof, they were told the route to Hail was quite safe, as all persons found away from the high road have their heads cut off. Hail derived its wealth from being on the camel caravan route of the Hajj. It has a complex history of trade, travel, conflict, and occupation, traces of which are left all over the countryside. The oldest and most significant relics here suggest that the Nafud generally, and Hail specifically, are the cradles of the Arabian people. Before crossing the great Red Nafud Desert to Hail, they had called upon the emir, who, although notorious for his cruelty, treated them with kindness.
Hail was a lion's den, though fortunately we were friends with the lion.
As Lady Anne traveled throughout these regions, she sketched and wrote, even while confronting the dangers of tribal warfare. Suffering injury and deprivation as she went, she was always drawing, often sketching roughly on scraps of paper to be worked on later. The drawings in her second book, A Pilgrimage to Nedge, conveyed as never before the harsh realities and subtle tones of the landscape and tribal life. Perhaps most important, by purchasing Arab stallions and mares that they shipped to their stud farm in England, Lady Anne and her husband helped preserve the pure-blood Arabian horse from extinction. Charles Doughty, tall, red-headed, and full-bearded, was one of the more unusual travelers to Arabia. As a geologist and linguist, he was always interested in the scientific aspects of his journeys. While on his travels, Doughty heard of the ancient desert city of Madain Saleh, even more remote and untouched than Petra, and he set off for it dressed as a Syrian in a caravan heading for Mecca. Towards the end of 1876, he reached Madain Saleh and spent time copying the inscriptions cut into the rock tombs. The extensive settlement of Madain Saleh took place during the 1st century AD, when it came under the rule of the Nabatean king Al-Harith IV, who made Madain Saleh the kingdom's second capital after Petra. The Nabatean kingdom was not just situated at the crossroads of trade, but also of culture. This is reflected in the varying motifs of the facade decorations, which borrow stylistic elements from Assyria, Phoenicia, Egypt, and Hellenistic Alexandria, combined with the native Nabatean artistic style. Roman decorations and Latin scripts also figured on the tombs after the territory was annexed by the Roman Empire. In contrast to the elaborate exteriors, the interiors of these rock structures are severe and plain. Leaving the Nabatean city, Richard Doughty's fascination for the nomadic way of life led him to travel for many months with Bedouins through their pasture lands and across the volcanic plains to Hail. When he arrived in Hail in October 1877, he was granted an audience with the emir, and they had a wide-ranging discussion covering everything from religion to botany. Several times on his travels, Doughty was robbed and left abandoned in the desert. He nearly died of starvation, was imprisoned, stoned, and stripped of all his possessions. Yet each time he made a narrow escape before falling into further trouble. In 1879, Doughty began working on his 600,000-word Travels in Arabia Deserta, which was published 9 years later. Doughty wrote, "The mountain sandstone, cloven down in cross lines, is here a maze of rhomboid masses, with deep and blind streets, as it were, of some lofty city lying between them." The book is remarkable for its detailed account of day-to-day Bedouin life and for its language. Doughty had the ability to conjure up a landscape through the use of heightened language, a skill which many professional geographers lacked. The last great 19th century European traveler to Mecca was the Dutch scholar of Oriental cultures and languages, Christiaan Snoeck-Groningen. In 1884, while serving as a lecturer at the University of Leiden in Holland, Snoeck-Groningen decided to travel to Mecca to study the lives of Muslims and the rites of the Hajj firsthand. Since the holy city of Mecca was strictly out of bounds for non-Muslims, Snoeck-Groningen made a decision to convert to Islam and live as a Muslim among Muslims. On the evening of February 2nd, 1885, he entered Mecca and performed the greeting ritual by circumambulating the Kaaba. He kissed the black stone and drank the holy water of the sacred well. For Snoeck-Groningen, these were moments fraught with emotion that he would never forget. As well as being a theological historian, Snoeck-Groningen was also an ethnologist who made use of the most modern resources, such as photography. He was the first European to photograph Mecca. His classic work, Mecca, reconstructs the history of the Holy City and sheds light on the origins of Islam, its early traditions and practices, and the first Islamic communities. It was a unique and revolutionary book, based not only on traditional Islamic history, but also offering new theoretical explanations of aspects of Islamic ritual and myth. In 1931, he wrote, "The prophet of world renouncement in Mecca wished to win souls for his faith. The prophet prince in Medina needed subjects and fighters for his army. Yet he was still the same Muhammad." In late 1885, Snouk Hogronya's Arabian adventure came to a sudden end when the Turkish governor ordered his immediate departure from Mecca and Arabia. He made Orientalists realize that a fundamental difference between Islam and Christianity was that under Islam, it was not the theology that was important, but the law. Islam is primarily a system of laws. How have you behaved towards the Almighty and your fellow man? This, according to Islam, is the key question you will be asked at the end of your life. Today, that's one of the first things a student learns about Islam, but at the time, it was far from natural. Snouk saw this because he was not only a theologist, but had actually lived in Mecca as a Muslim. Sir Wilfrid Thesiger was born in 1910 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Though he was educated in Britain, his early years in Africa gave him a lifelong yearning for remote places. In 1945, Thesiger joined the Desert Locusts Research Organization in Arabia, and it was while working for this organization that he first experienced the powerful draw of the empty quarter. It's one of the largest sand deserts in the world, which encompasses most of the southern third of the Arabian Peninsula, including southern Saudi Arabia and areas of Oman, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. Thesiger crossed the empty quarter twice by different routes from south to north. His first journey in 1946 started at Salalah and ended near the dunes of the Liwa Oasis. The second, in 1948, took him from Sulayil to Abu Dhabi. Altogether, he traveled some 10,000 miles on foot and on camelback. His journeys were fraught with danger, from warring tribes and starvation to the uncertainty of finding the next source of water. But Thesiger derived great satisfaction from the silence and purity of the desert and from the companionship of his fellow travelers. These are beautifully described in his masterpiece, Arabian Sands. He wrote, "Round us was a silence in which only the winds played, and a cleanness which was infinitely remote from the world of men." In addition to extended stays in the Middle East and Africa, Thesiger lived in the marshes of Iraq, as reported in his well-known book, The Marsh Arabs. Shrugging off the glories of Parthian and Persian power, ignoring the fame of Rome and Greece, the Marsh people adopted Arabic as their tongue, Islam as their religion, and the Bedouins as their heroes. Marsh Arabs who inhabit the area live in huts built from reeds with elaborate latticework entrances and attractive designs that go back to ancient times. Traveling by canoe, he won acceptance by dispensing medicine and treating the sick. In his account of this nearly lost civilization, he pays tribute to the hospitality, loyalty, courage, and endurance of this extraordinary people. Thesiger's lifetime of travels also took him to remote areas like the Hindu Kush and Kurdistan. But he wrote, "None of these places has moved me as did the deserts of Arabia." Over the centuries, the Arabian Peninsula has hosted a variety of Western explorers who were attracted by its inaccessible beauty, vast deserts, and rocky plains. With the fresh eyes of outsiders, they saw significance in the commonplace. describing their observations and recording the remarks and customs of the people they encountered. These explorers left an invaluable resource for posterity, and the records of these pioneers reveal Arabia as one of the most abundant archaeological regions in the world. The Arabian Peninsula stands on the threshold of a golden age of archaeological research and discovery, with a vast potential of sites connected with early human history waiting to be discovered in the foothills, escarpments, valleys, and deserts of this vast land.